Well, Russia promising it will begin to pull back troops from Georgia. But guess what? They're not going home. Russian forces only moving back as far as the breakaway region of South Ossetia. But Russia has broken promises in the past few days in Georgia, and Fox News crews now on the ground in Georgia tell us that there are about 100 more tanks now that have rolled into the country. So what is Russia really up to? And what does that mean for us? Joining us now is John Batchelor, the John Batchelor Show, which can be heard on ABC Radio tonight at 7 p.m. You know, John, for years you've been warning about Putin and Russians' intentions, and now we hear that the troops aren't going home completely. What does this mean?
Russia invaded a freedom-loving country that is an ally of the United States of America. This is a direct threat to the authority of NATO, and it's also a challenge to the Bush administration in the last months.
And you have now written, in your view, this is the end of NATO?
I believe that NATO no longer survives. I think the meeting on Tuesday will be the end. We need some new way to represent democracy. France and its negotiations with Russia and Georgia failed to understand that Russia is not a democracy, Georgia is. Someone must present the democracy's case because France is not representing it.
But Georgia is not a member of NATO, of course. They've talked about joining at some point, but there's no deadline, especially also with Ukraine.
What triggered this was that Georgia and Ukraine are looking to join NATO. Russia, the tyranny in Russia, the Kremlin, the gang that is rich enough to invade other countries, does not want Ukraine to join NATO. That's because the Crimea would come into NATO and Russia would lose its Black Sea Fleet port at Sevastopol. That's why they must stop. And the easy way to do it was to invade Georgia, break up NATO, and make sure Ukraine can't join.
Now, they're talking about the potential of kicking Russia out of the G8, for example, perhaps bringing Georgia into NATO. Do you think that'll be enough?
What I think is important is that on Friday, Donald Tusk, the Prime Minister of Poland, agreed to a missile battery, anti-missile battery, Patriot 3s, to be positioned in Poland. That's Star Wars, and that's what threatens the Kremlin. That gets their attention. This is the Cold War. The Kremlin pays attention to tanks and missiles, not to talk. G8 is nice, WTO is nice, the UN is nice. The Kremlin responds to force, and also markets. The market in Moscow plunged to the lowest rate in 2 years. That's going to correct Georgia faster than anything France can do.
And you talk about Poland and Moscow reacting. Look at what the general said on Friday, potentially saying that Poland could now be in Moscow's target.
Right. That wasn't just any old general, Eric. That was the Deputy Chief of Staff of the Soviet, excuse me, I did that on purpose, Russian forces, Nogovitsyn. And he said that Poland would be targeted. That is a threat. Poland's a member of NATO. The treaty.
John, say that again. What did he say, and what does that mean?
He said that he would have to necessarily 100% target Poland if they position Patriot 3 anti-missile battery in Poland. That means that NATO, as Poland as a member of NATO, has been threatened by a non-member of NATO. The treaty requires all to fight for Poland. That is a direct threat to the authority of NATO. Brussels, pay attention on Tuesday. You were threatened by tyrants.
But is this all talk? Because obviously there isn't any military action. And of course, the next question is, what happens if potentially there is?
Georgia is occupied, Eric. That first is the thing that must be on the argument when it comes to Tuesday in Brussels.
Well, they're not going to send NATO troops in to kick them out.
What will leave Georgia is the remnant of the decrepit Soviet army. Look at those T-72s. Look at them. They're 30 years old. They can't match anything we've got. This is a show of decrepit forces. The Soviet Russians know this. We will present the Russians with the missile shield in Poland. I continue to do that on the same sentence because that crowd in Russia needs to be acquainted with the fact that we never stood down.
That is the dire response, and that is the warning from John Batchelor on what is now happening in Europe and the threat that he says we face from Moscow to NATO and potentially to the United States. John, good to see you. Thank you very much for joining us with your insight. And if you want to know more about this very important issue after this week that may have changed the world, there it is. Russia, the angry giant, a special here on Fox.